Black Police Chief Lamont Taylor was stopped at night by a white patrol officer who found him suspicious. The officer demeaned him, unaware of Taylor's true identity. By morning, footage of the incident had spread across social media, revealing systemic racial bias and sparking events that would shake the entire city. Officer Jackson moved steadily along the quiet street, his footsteps soft but purposeful, echoing in the still night air. The street was mostly dark, with only the occasional flicker of a streetlight casting shadows along the pavement. It was a chill evening, and Jackson, a confident, broad-shouldered officer around 28 with close-cropped blonde hair and a firm stance, took in every detail with a cautious eye. On these late-night patrols, he trusted his instincts, letting his sense for anything out of place guide him. As he moved down the street, something caught his eye, a figure walking calmly along the opposite sidewalk. The man appeared to be in his early 50s, tall and dignified, his dark skin contrasting sharply against the crisp white collar of his dress shirt beneath an expensive, dark suit. With an air of confidence, he walked toward a sleek building illuminated by an upscale sign, his posture upright and purposeful. His suit was immaculate, and his tie sat perfectly knotted, giving him the look of someone with authority and presence. He held a leather briefcase in one hand with practiced composure, and his neatly trimmed hair added to his polished appearance. Yet Jackson felt a surge of suspicion, a gut feeling he couldn't shake. An empty street, the late hour, and a black man in such a pristine, expensive suit, it felt out of place to him. What's he doing here at this hour? Jackson thought, his curiosity tinged with wariness. Deciding to follow his instincts, he picked up his pace, crossing the street and closing the distance until he was just a few feet away from the man. His eyes narrowed as he took in every detail, scrutinizing the man's attire, his confident stance, and his expression, looking for any hint of something amiss. "Good evening, sir. Mind showing me some ID?" Jackson's voice was firm, steady, but there was an edge to it, a subtle tone of distrust that could be felt even through his attempt at polite formality. He kept his gaze locked on the man's face, watching for any flicker of nervousness, anything that might betray a reason for his unease. Lamont, the man before him, was no stranger to such encounters. His life and career had prepared him well for moments like this. Although surprised by the approach, he stayed composed, his face unreadable, his gaze calm but unyielding. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, taking out his ID and handing it to Jackson. His tone was polite, yet carried a pointed quality as he spoke. "Certainly, officer, though I can't see why my identity would be cause for suspicion," he said, each word measured, carrying an undertone that hinted at his awareness of the situation's irony. Jackson took the ID, his brows furrowing as he scanned it. The name and title were clear: Lamont Taylor, Chief of Police. But Jackson didn't react immediately, his expression remaining stern and distant, showing no shift in respect or recognition of the man's rank. Instead, he continued to look at Lamont with the same detached, assessing gaze, as if he were still trying to place him into some box, still processing what, if anything, made this man a suspicious figure in his eyes. Jackson leaned in closer, exuding a forceful energy that pushed the tension even higher. His posture was rigid, his arms crossed tightly, and his eyes were narrowed with a cutting suspicion that seemed to seek out every possible flaw or fault. The silence between his words was almost as pointed as the questions themselves. "So, what brings you here at this hour?" he asked, his tone soaked in sarcasm. He tilted his head slightly, sizing up Lamont as though any detail might betray a hidden agenda. "Why this neighborhood?" he continued, drawing out each word as if daring Lamont to slip up. "Waiting for someone?" His voice lingered, sharp and accusatory, his tone filled with a barely concealed contempt. Lamont felt the tension thickening, but stayed outwardly calm. His eyes remained steady, though there was now a controlled edge to his voice, a glint of irritation that hinted at his growing frustration. In a measured tone he responded, explaining that he was here on official business and had been delayed due to an evening meeting that ran late. His explanation was clear, confident, and left no room for misinterpretation. But Jackson's expression didn't soften. "Official business?" Jackson repeated, his eyebrows raised as though Lamont had just told him an unbelievable story. He let out a scoff, a dismissive sound that seemed to undermine Lamont's every word. "And in a suit?" he asked, letting the question hang, a mocking smile playing on his lips. "Doesn't that seem strange? A man like you, out here, at this time, in that suit?" He gestured toward Lamont's attire, his tone almost dripping with disdain. Lamont could sense the situation was becoming more serious. He knew it was time to clarify his position, to make his rank and authority known, hoping to cut off Jackson's suspicions before they led to an unnecessary escalation. He opened his mouth to explain, but Jackson quickly cut him off, his voice suddenly raised and aggressive. "Enough with the excuses!" Jackson snapped, waving his hand dismissively. "Show me your ID, or we're heading down to the station to sort this out," he demanded, his tone shifting from condescension to a thinly veiled threat. There was no mistaking the intent in his words. Jackson was treating this as though he had uncovered a criminal, not a man of authority. Lamont's eyes flickered, one eyebrow lifting slightly in a subtle sign of disbelief, but he kept his cool, refusing to let Jackson's attitude unsettle him. His expression was firm, exuding a calm dignity that did not waver, even as he realized people nearby were starting to take notice. A few passers-by paused, their curiosity piqued by the intensity of the encounter. Some quietly took out their phones, recording the scene as it unfolded, sensing that something significant was happening. Standing tall, Lamont met Jackson's gaze without flinching, aware that the situation was slipping from the officer's control. He knew the consequences of letting things spiral out of hand, yet he remained resolute, determined to see this through with the same quiet strength and dignity he had displayed throughout his career. Lamont's calm assurance was unshakable, grounded in the knowledge that the truth would soon come to light, and Jackson would come to understand the gravity of the mistake he was making. The moment, tense and electric, was charged with unspoken words and simmering awareness, as both men stood locked in a silent standoff under the watchful eyes of an unfolding audience. When Jackson, now irritated by Lamont's calm responses, insisted on detaining him, Lamont paused, his gaze sharpening. Without raising his voice, he calmly said, "You don't seem to understand who you're speaking to. My name is Lamont Taylor. I am the chief of police in this city." Jackson fell silent for a second, then nervously chuckled, as if hearing an unbelievable joke. However, after looking at Lamont's ID and confirming the truth, he slowly realized his catastrophic mistake. His expression shifted to a mix of shock and shame, his gaze darting around as if searching for an escape. A crowd had gathered. People watched with interest, some filming, with a camera trained squarely on Jackson, capturing every gesture, every reaction. Lamont took a step closer, his gaze penetrating and icy. He paused, letting Jackson absorb the full weight of his error, then said in a steady, assured voice, "This isn't just a random stop. This type of behavior is part of a systemic issue. Too many innocent people face similar humiliation every day, simply because someone decided they didn't belong." The crowd was silent with tension. Jackson started mumbling indistinct apologies, trying to excuse his actions and ease the situation. But Lamont was already done listening. He calmly scanned the crowd and nodded to a few bystanders, then turned and, with his dignity intact, walked away, leaving Jackson standing in utter humiliation. The next day, footage of the incident spread rapidly on social media, sparking widespread outrage. People were appalled, discussing how incidents like this highlight systemic racial bias within law enforcement. Journalists picked up the story, and soon, the video made national headlines, becoming a topic of discussion across the country. The police department launched an internal investigation to evaluate Jackson's actions and determine whether policies had been violated. Realizing that the incident could not go unaddressed, the department mandated that Jackson attend sensitivity and cultural competency training to prevent similar occurrences in the future. This incident became a call for the department to review its training approach. Meanwhile, Lamont Taylor, invited to a press conference, spoke confidently to the media. His words carried strength and conviction as he thanked the public for their support and emphasized that this confrontation was just one example of issues that affect many Black people and other minorities. Lamont called for not just isolated disciplinary actions, but comprehensive reform to eliminate bias. Each of us, Lamont said, wears the uniform to protect the community without dividing it into us and them. Our duty is to protect everyone, regardless of skin color or social status. Today marks the start of changes so that every resident can feel safe and be assured that their rights are protected. His words were met with applause, and the story garnered widespread attention. People hoped that this event would signal the beginning of long overdue changes in law enforcement practices.